All right, hello. Welcome to the Q&A number 2 for free will. We're going to go through the discussion questions that were posted for the Genet article and answer them. So if you saw the previous Q&A on Frankfurt, I answered these first 4 Genet questions, so we're not going to talk about those. We'll just start with the 5th. If you're here watching live, you can type some questions into chat and I can answer those, or you can type elaborations on these questions, anything you like in chat, and I will respond. But starting off, question number 1. On page 407, Genet says, so my intuition about Frankfurt's example, again, is that Jones may be responsible for its being the case that he does B at the precise time t1, something he could have... Although Jones may be responsible for its being the case that he does B at the precise time t1, something he could have avoided. He is not responsible for the obtaining of the temporally less specific state of affairs of his doing B by t3, because, given the presence of Black's mechanism, that is something he could not have avoided. While I understand how this stance is reached, I am to some degree convinced by it, I'm not clear on how this would be practically applied. How would laws function to reflect this? So, in practical circumstances, you never really have somebody like Black who's like watching over you and making sure you do something evil. In practical circumstances, typically when you do something bad, you do it because you chose to do it, and so this question never even arises. Like, if are you responsible for the doing B by t3? The answer is yes, because you did B at t1, and that's all that matters. If cases like the Black case were to come up, then the thought is, well, we'd still sort of treat them the same way. Why? Well, you're responsible for doing B at t1, and that's what we sort of punish you for. That's what the law punishes you for. We never make a law that says it's wrong for you to obtain the state of affairs of having done B by t3. That's just not the way we write laws. So this sort of thing, Genet is saying, doesn't really matter. It's true you're sort of stuck doing it, and if you choose not to do it at t1, you'll still end up doing it by t3 because of Black. But the law would never really reflect this. So if Genet is right, then the law wouldn't have to change. Here's one caveat, or one thing to add to that. If you think determinism is true, and you think determinism makes it the case that you can never avoid any of this obtaining by t3, and you can never avoid doing B at t1, then we're maybe in trouble. Then maybe we change the laws because you can never avoid even the thing at t1. Genet doesn't think that, so Genet doesn't worry about this. Frankfurt might think that, so that might be why Frankfurt is worried about this thing instead. But that's sort of a further point. Genet doesn't worry about any of this at all. He says, look, everything in real life is just like this normal case where you do B at t1, and you're just responsible for that. On page 412, Genet gives 3 examples of Smith and concludes that Smith is not morally responsible for her actions, since the device will in any way ensure that she remains seated. My question is, why is Smith not morally responsible for the action? Because when Smith made that decision, she didn't know about the device being there, and had the option of both either standing or remaining seated, but she chose to remain seated. Yeah, so this is similar to one of the questions we asked in the previous thing. Yeah, this was Srijan's question, and yeah. And so, good question. This, I think, is... so, I mean, we know what Genet thinks. Genet thinks Smith is not morally responsible. We can figure out what Frankfurt would think. Frankfurt would think Smith is morally responsible. And now you sort of have a choice. You have a choice to go with Genet, or you have a choice to go with Frankfurt. Lots of people find Genet plausible. They read Genet and they say, yeah, that sounds right. Lots of people find Frankfurt plausible. They read Frankfurt and they say, that sounds right. And I mean, sometimes when you have disputes like this, there's something further we can say. We can say, oh, here's what you might say about this or that for other reasons. And there are some things we could say. So we could talk about like the implications of Frankfurt's view or the implications of Genet's view, like we were doing up here. We could talk about what other views you might have to accept if you accept Frankfurt or if you accept Genet. So if you accept Genet, but you don't want to sort of just hold nobody responsible for anything because of determinism, then you need some sort of non-deterministic theory of free will, perhaps. We'll see one of those when we read whoever's coming up next on Wednesday. So that might be one way to start making some progress. But I think really fundamentally this is sort of like just a difference between Genet and Frankfurt, just like their intuitions are clashing. And they at least, I think, would want a lot of their argument to rest on kind of what the intuition is. And so they're hoping that you have the intuition that they have and not the one that they don't have. So a lot of this is just look inside yourself and, I don't know, decide, can you see it from Genet's point of view, or are you still on Frankfurt's side, or vice versa? I'm not sure what the specific reasons Genet has for dismissing examples 1, 2, and 3 as cases of the individual having genuine moral responsibility. Are page 411, 13. What he seems to be saying is that while moral responsibility can be assigned for some of the constitutive actions of standing, not standing for the Queen, it can't be assigned for the whole action of standing or not standing. The reasons he gives for this are unclear to me. It seems he is basing his arguments here off intuitions derived from the unaltered PAP, principle of alternate possibilities, and that it isn't possible to assign moral responsibility to someone if they couldn't do otherwise. However, I'm not sure if he justifies this with anything other than intuition. If that's the case, how can he be using an argument derived from PAP? Yeah, so in a way, a version of this earlier question. So like I just said, a lot of it does just come down to intuition, and Genet is hoping you have his intuition, not that you have Frankfurt's intuition, for instance. And I mean, sometimes that works. There, like, lots of people do read Genet and say yes. Other people read Genet and say no. And yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have anything to add to this answer that wasn't already said in the previous answer, but still a good question, of course. Should the conditions of the principle of alternate possibilities be satisfied in a situation, how is the moral responsibility apportioned? Moreover, even in the case where it's established that the agent could in fact do otherwise, will the other parties involved in the situation be free of moral responsibility? For instance, Jones may be responsible for committing the action by T2, but at this stage, Black's mechanism is already in place. Regardless of whether it's used or not, when Jones is held responsible at T2, will Black be exempt? Yeah, so we wouldn't exempt Black from any responsibility for putting in the mechanism, even though the mechanism isn't useful. We would hold Black responsible for setting up a mechanism which was designed to get Jones to do something bad. Do we hold Jones responsible? Yes, because he did something by T2. He did it at T1, so we hold him responsible in the normal way. So we have two people responsible for different things. There are puzzles you can have about sort of how to divide up responsibility and stuff. The puzzle is bigger if you look at it Frankfurt's way, where it's just, oh, Jones does something by T3, who is responsible, Jones or Black? Genet is saying, look, that's kind of confusing, but let's just look at it more clearly. Jones makes a choice. If Jones chooses not to do it, Jones is not responsible. If Jones chooses to do it, Jones is responsible. Black does this weird thing set up. That's not good. Black is responsible for that. What Genet doesn't say in the article, and this is the mistake I made on the reading quiz, Genet doesn't say Black is responsible at T3 when Jones do it. Jones does it. Genet thinks this, like this is why I made the mistake on the reading quiz. It's pretty natural to hold Black responsible if Black sort of forces Jones to do it with the mechanism. In a way, Black is just using Jones as a tool to do it, so we would blame Black for doing it just like if Black uses an axe to do it or some other tool. Genet doesn't say that in the article. But, I mean, whatever Black is doing, like, there's something bad there. Like, there's nothing wrong with holding Black responsible for that sort of thing. So I think just in the specific cases we're talking about, apportioning responsibility is maybe not too troubling. Jones gets the responsibility for doing the thing if he chooses to do it. He doesn't if he doesn't choose to do it. Black gets responsibility for setting up a weird device, maybe also for doing it if he gets Jones to do it. Nothing more to say. There are more puzzling cases, but, you know, let's not puzzle ourselves too much. Let's just stick with Jones and Black for now. But yeah, raise more puzzling questions if you have other cases where it's harder to slice things up. Frankfurt seems to say that should Jones kill at T1 by his own will, he would have done so later as well, where the mechanism's not there. He says the PAP does not account for those who had the motive but were lucky in that their conditions dictated them having no responsibility. So therefore he is broadly responsible and he creates a stronger criteria. Genet, meanwhile, says that yes, he is morally responsible during period 1, but not responsible thereafter. Isn't this just the same application of Frankfurt's argument but to its components? Janae says there's a difference between his view and Frankfurt, but I think Frankfurt, where he provided the same breakup of time, would have given the same answer. Yeah, so let's look closer. He said he would have done so later as well were the mechanisms not there. Yeah, so the example is sort of he either will or he won't. He chooses to do so, and so he does at T1. Would he have done it later? I mean, we don't know. I mean, we can sort of assume if nothing changes, maybe he'd make the same decision. But I don't know. You might make a decision at one time, and then just things change, and so you wouldn't make the same decision. But yeah, it's not like he'd sort of give up a life of crime or something. So he says the PAP does not account for those who had motive but were lucky, and that their conditions dictated them having no responsibility. So he's broadly responsible. Oh, so maybe you're talking about when Frankfurt says he's responsible for having like a bad character, for sort of wanting to kill this person and like waiting out for an opportunity. So even if he gets lucky and doesn't do it at T1, he's still like responsible in the sense that we know he has a bad motive and he's looking out ready to kill. And so we'd still hold him responsible for that, even though we don't hold him responsible for killing at T1 if he manages to avoid it due to luck. So yeah, Frankfurt says that. And Genet says, yes, he's morally responsible, but not thereafter. Isn't this just the same application of Frankfurt's argument to its components? So to its components, I'm not sure what the its is. There's a difference given the same breakup of time. Yeah, so what you might be saying is Frankfurt says we don't hold Jones responsible if he doesn't do it at T1, except in the broader sense where we hold him responsible for being a bad person. So how would Frankfurt give the same answer? Is it like Frankfurt says not responsible at T1 if you don't do it at T1? Genet says not responsible at T1 if you don't do T1. It's the same answer. So, I mean, here's the setup. Genet says Frankfurt's looking at it too unspecifically. He says Frankfurt is thinking about it, are you responsible for doing the thing if you couldn't have avoided doing it otherwise? And the answer is you can be if you chose to do the thing. Genet says that's not clear enough. Are you responsible for the thing? Well, if you chose to do the thing, then you're responsible for doing it, for making that choice at T1, and the choice leads to the action, so you do the thing. But if you don't make the choice, you're not responsible for doing the thing, and you're also not responsible for sort of doing the thing because that, you know, would have happened either way. What you're responsible for is the sort of choice at T1 and maybe doing the thing sort of in that specific way, having made the choice. And so Frankfurt just says you're sort of broadly responsible for the thing. Genet says you're responsible for like your decision to do the thing and the thing resulting from that decision, not the thing more broadly. So I'm not sure if that's a difference between, I mean, what are they arguing about? The principle of alternate possibilities. Frankfurt says the principle of alternate possibilities says you're not responsible for these things. Genet says, well, it's true you're not responsible for the thing at T3, but you are responsible for the choice. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but if you're in chat, you can say more if you want to talk in office hours or something. We can say more. On page 415, on the second explanatory note, Genet says, to me, however, it seems evident that one is responsible for one's action of a certain time, if and only if one is responsible for its being the case that one acted in that way at the time. Why is time relevant in judging if Jones should be morally responsible for his action or not? Even if he does the action without any knowledge of Black's mechanism, shouldn't Jones be morally responsible for what he did regardless of when he actually does it? How will time influence Jones's action or Black's mechanism if Jones wanted to kill in his own way, in this case kill the relative? So now, if Jones had already planned on killing the relative, and he does it at a time which is evident that the action is independent of Black's mechanism, Jones should be morally responsible for it, even if his action did not take place at a certain time. Shouldn't the fact that the action took place be enough for Jones to be held morally responsible? Good, so maybe we'll look at the ant smothering case, or this smothering case. So this is why Genet says we have to be more specific. It's true you're responsible for smothering the relative, killing the relative. But let's be clearer. You're responsible for smothering the relative at that time for having made that choice. Are you responsible for smothering the relative, period? No. Why not? Because, due to the device, you couldn't have avoided smothering the relative. You were stuck smothering the relative. One way or another, you were gonna do it. And so, because of the principle of alternate possibilities, you're not responsible. You couldn't have avoided it. You're off the hook for smothering your relative. And you say, well, that's strange, I'm not responsible. And the answer is no, you are responsible for a more specific thing, smothering your relative at that time, at when you did it. Why is that any different? Like, why, what's the difference between that and smothering your relative? Well, I mean, morally speaking, it's not different. Genet is not saying anything strange about morality. He's just saying, look, the principle of alternate possibilities is true, but we can still save the fact that you're responsible even though you had no alternate possibilities. Why? Because the thing you're not responsible for is like this broader description. What you aren't what you are responsible for is the more narrow description. So on your own rather than as a result of Black's mechanism. Oh, sorry, no. That's the mistake. For the choice. Sorry, yeah. Should not have just looked over at the article and just looked at the first thing. So can we find... yeah, so it's hard because Genet's explanation is sort of smeared over all these pages, but the thought is that you're sort of not responsible for the broad thing. You're not responsible for the obtaining of the temporally less specific state of affairs because you couldn't have avoided it. But you're responsible for the more narrow thing. So that's why we sort of add in time. It's not like time is morally relevant. It's what's morally relevant is the more specific description, because the more specific description, that didn't have to happen. You could have avoided it by making a different choice. And if you make a different choice, then the mechanism kicks in, and then you do it for a different reason. On 407, while trying to strengthen his intuitive inference that Jones is not responsible for doing the event B by T3, Genet brings up Black's point of view. He says that Black knew that Jones would ultimately do B by T3 and would find it natural to deny that Jones is responsible for that fact. After all, Black has arranged things to ensure it has set up a condition that is, in the circumstances, sufficient for it. And Black will find it natural to say that if it turns out that Jones does B at some time before the deadline T2, then Jones will be responsible for that fact. I don't understand how Black's point of view offers any new backing to believe Genet's intuition, as it seems like Genet is simply begging the question in the case of what Black's point of view is, or what's Black's point of view. Can you elaborate on how this strengthens this argument? Yeah, so this is similar to the earlier stuff about the intuition about standing up or sitting down for the queen and the bar. Some people will find Genet plausible here. Some people will not find Genet plausible. And I don't know if there's a ton more for Genet to say if you're not convinced. I don't know there's a ton more for Frankfurt to say if you're convinced by Genet. The more there is to say, you sort of go back and listen to my answer for the earlier question. So this is a good point. So is he doing anything more than begging the question? Not really. I mean, he's saying, isn't it natural? Like, doesn't it seem like this? And then it's up to you to decide. And presumably, if you're asking the question, the answer is no, it doesn't seem natural to me. And that's fine. I don't think you're sort of missing something crucial in Genet. I think he's just saying, well, it should sound natural. I'm describing it the right way. I mean, we could try to make it sound more natural. We could sort of, we can make a movie where this happens and somebody's watching and the villain is saying, oh, it's he doesn't know that I've already set things up and he has no choice and stuff. In the second example Smith describes on page 412, Genet claims that Smith is not responsible for not standing up since there exists a barrier that will automatically obstruct any attempts that should she even think of possibly doing so. Unlike in the previous example, the barrier is not prematurely deployed to prevent her from standing up. In this case, then, shouldn't Smith be considered morally responsible because she chose not to stand up out of her own volition, never even considering the alternative. There is no external influence on her decision, she willingly never thinks about standing up, and follows through on it without the strap holding her down. If not, who is responsible? Someone must be, given that the act did not occur spontaneously. The mechanism did not play any role in the entire incident, making it, in my opinion, blameless. Yeah, so the thought is that so he says, look, you're blameworthy or praiseworthy for not trying to stand up or for intentionally not standing up. You do get praise or blame for that. We do say you're responsible for not trying or for intentionally not standing. That's true. We don't say you're responsible for not standing up, period. Not for not trying to stand up, not for intentionally not standing up, but for not standing up. Because Genet says, look, you couldn't have stood up. Like, you didn't have a choice there, really. If you had tried to stand up, the barrier would have flipped over you. So you do, it's not like you're not responsible for anything. So it's not like there's zero responsibility. You're responsible for not trying to stand up. You're responsible for intentionally not standing up, not trying to stand up. But you're not responsible for not standing up. That's the thought. This is, so Genet's basic point in this article is, let's be more specific about what we're saying. You're responsible for one specific thing, but not for like the broad action that occurs. Because that had to occur. There was no alternate possibility. Someone must be responsible. You could, I think, hold the view that nobody's responsible for anything. So if you believe the principle of alternate possibilities, and you believe determinism, so that everything has to occur, then you think nobody's responsible for anything. Basically, I mean, maybe there's other ways out. But the thought is determinism plus principle of alternate possibilities says there are no alternate possibilities, so nobody's responsible for anything. And we'll see something like this when we read Strawson and Paraboom. So someone must be, given that the act did not occur spontaneously. Maybe not. We'll see. In the first counterexample to Frankfurt's general thesis G, which ostensibly serves to refute the PAP, Genet mentions that since there was a physical barrier prevented Smith from standing up, Smith cannot be blamed or praised for not actually standing up, can only be held morally responsible for not trying to stand up, which is something she could have done or intentionally. Good, great, this is the quote we just read, that's perfect. Since the act of not standing up entails the intention of not standing up, which causally influences the act, can we not hold Smith responsible for both the intention and, as a corollary, the action of not standing up? Since in the absence of the mechanism, Smith would still not stand up, it seems that Smith can be held responsible for not standing up. My question casts a partial doubt on Genet's. Yeah, so the thought is that it's true that the intention influences the act, but the act is, we might say, like, over-determined is what we say when something is going to happen and there are sort of multiple things that are ensuring it's going to happen, and you could take away at least one of the things and it would still happen. So sort of Smith was not going to stand up here. Smith didn't want to stand up, and there's this barrier that was either there or it's an automatic barrier. So it's basically already determined, effectively, that Smith is not going to stand up. And the thought is that the principle of alternate possibility says if there's no possibility there, if Smith has to stay seated, then Smith can't be responsible for it. Smith had no other option. If you're stuck doing something, it's not fair to hold you responsible. How could you be responsible for something you couldn't not do? So that's the thought. It's true that you contribute to not standing up, but it was going to happen anyways. So, how can we hold you responsible? We can hold you responsible for your choice or your intention. But we can't hold you responsible for not standing up, is what Genet wants us to say. And what's the principle of alternate possibilities wants us to say. On page 411, Genet says that in example 1, Smith should not be held responsible for not getting up. Example 1, it states that if Smith tries to get up, then a strap attached to her seat wraps around her and prevents her from doing so. But if she intentionally does not get up and keeps sitting, then the strap would not wrap around her legs. Why does Genet then not hold her responsible for sitting down intentionally when she does it of her own free will? And so he does hold her responsible for sitting down intentionally. So that's the quote we just read. For intentionally not standing up, she does get credit. What she doesn't get credit for is not standing up, period. So are you responsible for not standing up? No. Why? No other possibility. You had to sit down. Are you responsible for not intentionally standing up? Yes, you are responsible for that. You did have control over that because you have control over your intentions. So you could have unintentionally stayed seated if the strap keeps you there. So, but that didn't happen. You intentionally stayed seated, or Smith intentionally stayed seated. So her intentions made a difference. So she is responsible for that. Good. At the end of his paper in the notes section, Genet remarks, does Black's having set up, shit. Maybe I really fucked up. Oh boy. Does he really say this? Okay, so clearly he says this. He says, does Black's having set up sufficient conditions for Jones doing B by T3 mean that Black was responsible for the fact that Jones did B by T3? I'm inclined to think not. To my ear, saying that Black was responsible for that fact implies if it weren't for the sufficient condition that Black set up, the fact would not have obtained. And that is false. Jones also contributed a sufficient condition for it. Oh, okay, good. So I didn't, sorry, this is about the quiz question that I screwed up. So good. Jones also contributed a sufficient condition for it, his doing B at T1. That means that neither Jones nor Black can be said to be responsible for that fact. Oh, what goes in here? Sorry, I'm trying to read the note that this is referring to. Oh, here we go. These two sufficient. Okay, we'll read this in a moment. I disagree with this notion as can't it be argued that by setting up these mechanisms in the first place, Black has intervened in Jones's agency in advance, and thus should be presumed responsible thereafter for all accompanying actions, regardless of whether those mechanisms. Yeah, so we can definitely hold Black responsible for setting up the mechanism. Genet doesn't want to deny that. So Black is a jerk, and Black should be punished or something, because Black set up this mechanism, and that's not good. You shouldn't set up this mechanism. But setting up the mechanism isn't what causes Jones to do this thing at T1. Jones's choice causes Jones to do it at T1. In fact, the way the mechanism works, it's only going to fire, it's only going to go into effect if Jones doesn't make the choice to do it. And so in this case, the mechanism doesn't do anything. So you wouldn't want to hold Black responsible for doing it at T1 because the mechanism didn't do anything like that. The mechanism was completely useless. Black might as well not have put the mechanism there. Again, hold Black responsible for putting the mechanism there, but don't hold Black responsible for Jones doing the thing at T1. That was Jones's choice. And so Jones doing B by T3, in this case where Jones makes the choice, that's also sort of just a result of Jones doing the thing. Black is no more responsible for Jones doing B by T3 than Jones is. Neither of them are responsible for that. Why? Because there was sort of no alternate possibility. It couldn't have been otherwise. It was going to happen one way or the other. They are each responsible for more individual things, Jones making the choice and Black setting up the mechanism. And although he doesn't say it in this article, so this is where I screwed up in the reading quiz, you could say that Black is responsible if Jones chooses not to do it and then the mechanism fires, and so the mechanism forces Jones to do it. That would be saying Black is responsible. But that's doing B sort of at T2.5 or something, or doing B at T3, but not doing B by T3. Doing B by T3, the more general description. Nobody's responsible for that. Why? Because it was unavoidable. There were no alternate possibilities. Oh, and here we have the overdetermination stuff. So A and B simultaneously fire bullets through C's head. So this is another example. Back up here if you're interested in overdetermination. According to Genet, Jones is responsible for doing B at T1, but not responsible for doing B at T3, since the former can be avoided, unlike the latter. Jones doing B at T1 differs from Jones doing B at T3 by being temporally more specific. Genet argues that one is not responsible for the temporally less specific state of affairs, but may be responsible for the temporally more specific state of affairs. This is an example where one is responsible for their being now in a particular room, but not responsible for their being now within a 1 million mile radius of the center of the Earth. However, couldn't one also be responsible for the latter temporally less specific affairs, since it's their choice not to be an astronaut and to get onto a spaceship in space? Similarly, couldn't Jones also be responsible for doing B by T3? In the case he does B at T1, wouldn't he also be morally responsible for doing it B by T3, since he did B in both states of affairs solely because of intention and choice? Additionally, if he doesn't do B at T1, then it is his choice not to do B at T1, and hence he is stuck in a situation where Black's mechanism Yeah, good. So first, astronaut thing, that won't get you more than 1 million miles away from Earth. So that's that sounds like a silly answer, but no, that's the answer. Yeah, you're not responsible for being stuck within 1 million miles from Earth because you can't. There's no other possibility. You can't get further away. Even if you become an astronaut, you'll still be within 1 million miles. Similarly, couldn't Jones also be responsible by doing T? Wouldn't he also be more since then? Since he did B in both states of affairs solely because of the intention. So the thing is, true, but doing B by T3, he couldn't have avoided it. There was no other possibility. And the thought is, if you can't avoid it, you're not responsible. That's what the principle of alternate possibility says. So just look, Genet finds the PAP convincing. Additionally, if he doesn't do B at T1, then isn't it his choice to not do B at T1, and hence he chose to stuck in this situation where Black's so he doesn't know about the mechanism. So no, he's not responsible for that because the mechanism is it's unknowing. Even if he knew about the mechanism, I think it's a little unfair to hold him responsible. If he says, no, I'm not going to kill my relative, that would be wrong. I know there's a mechanism that's going to make me do it, but yeah, I refuse. Would you still hold him responsible just because he knows about the mechanism? That seems kind of harsh. But, I mean, the easier thing is just to say he doesn't know about the mechanism. So, to address the first Smith scenario with the belt mechanism, Genet explains that Smith cannot be held accountable for her action of not standing up as a physical barrier made it impossible for her to do so. Yet, Smith may still be to blame for or praised for not trying to stand up, which is something she could have done, or for intentionally not standing up, which is something she could have avoided. Good, the same quote that we read before. However, this discourse of placing responsibility on Trist seems, 1, insignificant, as it's inconsequential to the end outcome, and 2, irrelevant, as we're trying to ascertain the responsibility of actions rather than attempts and intentions. As such, what's the point? So first, is it insignificant, as it's inconsequential to the end outcome? Well, you might think it's actually very significant. So if somebody doesn't stand up because they hate the queen or whatever, that means one thing. If somebody doesn't stand up because they've got a strap over their lap, that's another thing. And those are two completely different things. Should we sort of praise or blame somebody for not standing up for the queen? Well, I need to know why they didn't stand up. Is it because of the strap or is it because of their reasons? So we certainly care about the reasons people do things. And we also, Genet thinks, care about the principle of alternate possibilities, which is that you're not responsible for things you couldn't have avoided. And so in this case, you couldn't have avoided this thing. So you might say, oh, no responsibility at all. But that seems like the wrong answer because you do want to hold Smith responsible either to praise her or to blame her for not standing up. So how are we going to do both? How are we going to take the PAP and also hold Smith responsible? Here's the answer. We hold Smith responsible for the intention or for trying to stand up. And we excuse Smith for not standing up, or we don't hold Smith responsible for not standing up because of the strap. So we get both things that we want. We get to keep the PAP and we get to praise or blame Smith. So it's insignificant in terms of what happens, but it's not insignificant in terms of our evaluation of Smith's moral character in conjunction with the PAP, which Genet wants to keep. And irrelevant as we're trying to ascertain the possibility of actions rather than intents. So this is something Genet has to deny. Genet has to say, look, it's actually not the action that matters in the Smith case, because the action, not standing up, or in this case, the non-action, because it's not standing up, the action actually is irrelevant. Because you were stuck doing that action. You had to stay seated one way or the other. Smith wasn't getting up from her chair. So the action, Genet says, really doesn't matter. It was sort of determined beforehand. It was going to happen no matter what. So that's actually not what we care about in this case, Genet thinks. So whether or not that's right, that at least is Genet's point of view, which is, no, we're not trying to ascertain responsibility for actions. We're trying to look at intents or intentions. Here's another way of answering, which is the same, just another way of describing it. We do care about actions, but which actions? Not the action of staying seated. That action is, nobody's responsible for it because there's the belt, so you're stuck. So you're not responsible for that. You are responsible for the following actions. Choosing to stay seated. Choice is an action. You chose actively. That's an active choice. That's an action. Or intending to stay seated. That's an action. Having an intention, like intending to do something, that itself is an action. So that's something else Genet could say. He could say these count as actions. And like I said, those are two ways of describing the same thing. One is that I don't care about the action, it's already determined. The other is that, oh, the choice or the intention, those are actions. And either is fine. Genet says, notice I am not saying that what Jones may be responsible for is it being the case that he does B on his own rather than as a result of Black's mechanism. It would be a mistake to say this. What I say is Jones may be responsible for it being the case that he does B at T1. He did know that he was making that fact obtain. I don't understand the difference between the two. From the point after B is obtained, say T4, there really is not a difference between Jones making B obtain out of his own volition and B obtaining at T1. What is the upshot of this distinction? B obtaining at T1 is true. That is the same as making B obtain out of his own volition. But B obtaining at T3 is not the same. And the reason why is that obtaining it by T3 is also describes what happens if the Black mechanism does it. So B obtaining at T3 by T3 is not the same as Jones making B obtain out of his own volition, because B obtaining at T3 by T3 is the same as Jones making B obtain out of his own volition or the mechanism. So they're not the same. So looking back from T4, it's true from the perspective of T3, you can't tell whether Jones did it or Black did it, basically. Like, not like you can't tell, but like it sort of doesn't matter. The point of saying by T3 is that it combines the two, and that's what Genet thinks Frankfurt's mistake is. Frankfurt's mistake is he just shoves everything into T3 and says, who's responsible for something obtaining by T3? And Genet says, no, let's be more clear. T3, nobody's responsible for. Obtaining by T3, nobody's responsible for because it had to happen. Everybody's excused. But obtaining at T1, that's what Jones is responsible. If Jones doesn't do it, then it obtains at T2. I think T2 is the time he uses. Yeah, whatever. It obtains at some other time, in which case that's Black's fault, although he doesn't specifically say it. It's at least not Jones's fault. And so those are sort of separate things. So there's no difference if we sort of ignore T1 and just look at T3. And Genet says that's what Frankfurt is doing, but he's saying, don't do that. On page 406, Genet discusses the possibility in the Jones-Black example that Jones always had the option to smother his relative at a prior time T2, for which it would be possible for holding responsible at least at that moment in time. Later in the paper, Genet introduces the condition C that compels Jones to act and smother his relative, independent of Black's coercion. Genet's introduction of C appears arbitrary to me. Isn't it possible to attribute one's actions at any given moment to a large host of causal factors? Why did Genet introduce another level of compulsion? Why? Why C? So C is something that, yeah, it's complicated. So, Genet has just explained why he doesn't agree with Frankfurt. And then he says, oh, but look, a defender of Frankfurt's argument might think that my finding could be blocked by revising the example, so that this difference is eliminated, so that the precise time at which Jones actually does B, the precise time at which Black's mechanism would cause Jones to do B are the same. Because what we've been saying is, Jones is responsible for smothering at T1, but not at T3. Why? Because at T1 he makes the choice and it happens. If he didn't make the choice, then it would have happened later once Black's mechanism fires at T2 or something. Either way, it happens by T3, but it's different, either at T1 when he chooses or T2 when the mechanism. So that's, then like Frankfurt responds and says, oh, no, what if we make it all happens at T1? So now forget the T3 stuff. Is Jones responsible for doing it at T1? Then what do we say? But I think such a move can't succeed in saving Frankfurt's argument. For in order to ensure that two times are the same, Black's mechanism would have to be set up so that it's triggered by the absence of some condition whose actual presence is causally sufficient to ensure that Jones does B at T1. So the thought is, the mechanism, how's it going to work? How's it going to get Jones to do it at T1? Well, it's going to scan Jones's brain right before T1, and it's going to look for something. If it finds the thing, it's going to look for whether Jones is going to do it at T1. If Jones is going to do it at T1, the mechanism's like, okay, whatever, I'm just going to sleep this one. If it doesn't see that thing, then it's going to make Jones do it. It's going to fire, it's going to trigger, and it's going to zap Jones, and it's going to make him do it at T1. That is, it would have to be posited first that there occurred at a time T0 prior to Jones doing B at T1, a condition C that was causally sufficient for his doing B at T1. And second, that Black's mechanism was rigged so that had C failed to occur at T0, the mechanism would have causally necessitated Jones doing B at T1. So the mechanism is scanning before Jones is about to smother or not smother. And it's looking for something else. It's looking for the thing in his brain that's going to make him do it or not. If it sees it, it's like, okay, whatever, have luck, have fun, good luck. If it doesn't see it, then it snaps into action and it makes him. So now we rewind. We go to T0, and this is when it's doing the scanning, and it's looking for C. Condition C at T0 must be such that its obtaining makes the case that it's not open for Jones to T0 to avoid doing it B at T1. That is, from T0 on, Jones cannot avoid doing B at T1. Otherwise, if there were no such condition C, whose presence at T0 forces Jones to do B at T1, and whose absence at T0 would cause Black's mechanism, blah, 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 then there would be nothing in the example that entails that Jones could not avoid doing B at T1. So there's got to be something the mechanism is scanning for, and if it sees it, it knows Jones is going to do the thing. Jones has already decided. And if it doesn't see it, then it snaps into action. So there's got to be something that forces Jones effectively, like his own decision, makes him about to smother his relative. So the mechanism is looking for that. If you say no, the mechanism can never know whether he's going to do it or not. There can't be a condition C that's going to force him to do it. Then the thought is, well, then he doesn't have to do it. The mechanism can't scan him because he's always got the choice. So there's got to be something, C, which the mechanism is looking for, which is going to make him do it or not. Now, what do we say about this? What can Jones be responsible for here? That depends, it seems to me, on whether or not the occurrence of C at T0 is such that the following things are true of it. So this thing that's in Jones's brain that's going to get him to smother his relative, what do we say about it? Is it true that Jones could have prevented it? Did he know or could have known how he could do this? And did he know or could have known that it would mean that from T0 on, he'd be unable to avoid doing B at T1? So, could Jones have avoided this thing? C? Does he know about this thing? Does he know this thing is going to make him smother his relative? If it does satisfy these conditions, then we PAP sympathizers will find it natural to say that Jones may be responsible for here is not his doing B at T1 since he could have avoided it, but rather his not trying to avoid B at T1 by preventing or not contributing the occurrence of C at T0 and his occurrence, blah, blah, blah. So here's this thing, it's going to make him smother his relative. If he knows about it, he could have prevented it, and he knew it was going to make him smother his relative, he should have done something about it. So he's responsible for this thing. What is this thing, C, that we're talking about? Here's the simplest example. C is a choice to smother your relative. So it could be that. In principle, C could be anything. But, the simplest case, C is a choice to smother your relative. Jones could have prevented his choice. He knew about his choice. He knew that making the choice would make him smother the relative. So there you go. So he introduces all of this stuff to respond to the objection from Frankfurt, which is that, oh, what if, you're talking about T1 and T3 and you're saying they're separate things. What if we smush it all into T1? And Genet says that's not going to work because we can go back to T0 and it turns out that's where all the action is happening. Genet counters thesis G on page 411 through example 1, amongst many other examples about Smith, by arguing it's abundantly clear because there's a physical barrier. Yeah, so we've read this quote 3 or 4 times already, so this is a popular quote. Good. How would this mean that Smith shouldn't be responsible for actually not standing up? In her case of action, she was played as not intentionally. Yeah, so good. Perfect question. I've answered it 2 or 3 times already, so go back. One convincing objection to Frankfurt's claim that the principle of alternate possibility is wrong has been that although Jones 3 did not actually have an alternate possibility open to him, he still thought he did and made the decision on his own, all while thinking he had an option. This means that in all the relevant senses, Jones did indeed have an alternate possibility. So Jones is morally responsible for his action, and he also had an alternate possibility, so PAP is proven false as Frankfurt claims. In his paper, Genet claims that Smith isn't responsible for not standing up. Oh, here we go. However, Smith is unaware, so effectively has alternate possibilities. Shouldn't this technically mean Sorry, I should be reading this out loud. This is lazy. Is unaware of the device, so effectively she, like Jones 3, has alternate possibilities in all the relevant senses open to her as well. Shouldn't this technically mean that Smith should be held responsible for not standing up, even if she didn't try? Also on page 413 again. Well, okay, so first question. The answer is no. So the principle of alternate possibilities, so let's actually look at this. Genet refines it a bit. He says, you're responsible for its being the case, or sorry, S is responsible for it being the case that S acted in a certain way at a certain time, only if S could have made it the case. It could have made it not the case that X acted in that way then. So it's not about what you think is true. Jones thinks he could do something else. Smith thinks she can stand up. But that's not relevant. That doesn't show up anywhere in the principle of alternate possibilities. Principle of alternate possibilities is about what possibilities are actually open to you. And if there are no actual possibilities, you think there are, but there aren't, then you're excused. You're off the hook. So this won't work. You can modify the PAP and say, oh, if you think you have other possibilities, then you're excused. But Genet doesn't do that. On 413 again, Genet mentions how another philosopher named Fisher, John Martin Fisher, agrees that an agent shouldn't be held morally responsible for non-actions, but like Frankfurt, he thinks they should be held morally responsible for acting a certain way, even if they couldn't have avoided acting. Could you clarify what means the control? I don't quite understand. Here we go. Fisher cannot be held responsible again, but about Frankfurt, yes. Responsibility and control. So. Yeah, so control is when you are sort of in charge of whether X happens sort of in a certain way. You're not in control of X entirely, but you're in control of sort of the way X happens. And so Smith is sort of responsible for the way her sitting down happens. It can happen intentionally, or it can happen unintentionally, or whatever. And she makes it happen intentionally. So she has sort of control over the way that it happens. When you smother your relative, you either do it because Black's device did it, or because you made the choice to do it. And so you have control over sort of the way that you're smothering your relative. And so the thought is you're responsible for an action when you sort of have control over the action. So basically what that, the practical upshot of that is that sort of, when you're the one doing it for your reasons, you have control over it. So that's the thought there. Good, so no questions in chat. Thank you for tuning in live. If you tuned in live, this says there are some viewers, so that's fun. Thank you for watching later. If you watch later, I hope you found this useful, and I will see you on Wednesday for a live stream of questions about Ekstrom, I think, or Frankfurt. I don't know. We'll find out.